Brother Shahran. So tonight I will continue with my series of lectures, and it will be on the, contemporary philosophy of science and Islam. So it's a big subject, contemporary philosophy of science, meaning to say Western philosophy of science. And I normally take one semester to teach the course. And now I'm trying to compress it in 1 hour lecture. But never mind, I will just pick out the salient points of the various streams and schools of thought in contemporary Western philosophy of science, and try to show how it is relevant to the Islamic discourse on science and philosophy of science. So as I put down there on the slide, I'll be mainly talking about the major schools of thought in contemporary philosophy of science, which actually stretch back to the 20th century, not just the 21st. And this includes logical positivism, Karl Popper's philosophy of science, Thomas Kuhn's philosophy of science, and then the Edinburgh School, and also the post-positivist and postmodernist critics of science. So basically, what I'm trying to do here is to present this philosophies of science as what I would call grand narratives for the philosophical legitimation of science. That means to say that although science is already institutionalized in modern society and accepted as part of the modern system of organization and part of the economic and technological system and so on, yet as a kind of a belief system, science nevertheless needs some form of legitimation because it is seen as being in competition with other belief systems, for example, religious belief systems and so on. And so modernity here is not taken for granted insofar as science is concerned, because normally one would say that from a Western point of view, what sustains modernity and on what basis modernity is built. It is basically built on science and the scientific worldview, because the West has rejected religion and rejected God, so they have replaced and substituted it with science. So science is not only a form of knowledge about the natural world, but also forms a worldview of the modern world and of modern society and culture. That is the view which they hold to be true of the world, based on science. So they need some form of philosophical justification for science, of philosophical legitimation of science, to convince modern society that there is a rational basis for regarding science as the foundation of modern society, not only in terms of technological practice, but also in terms of social belief, social and cultural belief. So in this sense, I would argue that philosophy of science, and also to some extent the history of science, are not purely intellectual or academic disciplines that have no wider significance, that have no wider implications or relevance to the wider context. They are relevant. In fact, one of the philosophers of science by the name of Larry Loudon said that philosophers of science are the cultural bearers. They are the cultural bearers of science in modern society. So, despite the fact that science is there, it needs some sort of philosophical justification, so as to be entrenched in the social and cultural belief system. And here, these legitimation attempts are made by several philosophers and schools of thought, or philosophers that represent schools of thought. And I will begin with logical positivism. which has its origins in the Vienna Circle, which was quite active between 1924 and 1936. And actually there is another group known as the Berlin Group, headed by Hans Reichenbach, but I just want to focus on the Vienna Circle here. And secondly, after logical positivism, we'll look at the philosophy of science of Karl Popper, who was quite influential also, not only as the critique of logical positivism, but also as someone who propounds his own philosophy of falsificationism in its own right. Yeah? And it was quite influential in Britain and to some extent in America. Yeah? In English-speaking countries, yeah? The Commonwealth countries, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and so on, which are closely associated with British philosophy. So Popper's influence is quite strong in those countries. Yeah? And also in the former colonies, yeah, which has British education as its standard form of education previously. Yeah? And also, I will look at the philosophy of science of Thomas Kuhn, who criticized the logical positivists and also Karl Popper, and can be said to have inaugurated this new wave and this new move against the previously accepted conventional wisdom concerning science. Yeah? The previous status quo image of science, I would call it, began to be criticized by Thomas Kuhn and later by Feyerabend. And then the floodgates became wide open, and then you have all these social constructivist and postmodernist critiques of science. So much so that the image of science now is so battered, so hard hit that it needs to be defended, yeah? By those who still have some hope for the scientific enterprise as not only as a feeder to technology, but as a system of knowledge in its own right. Yeah? Okay, so can we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, let's begin with the logical positivists. Yeah? Now, the logical positivists are based mainly in Vienna and form what is known as the Vienna Circle. They were mainly scientists, mathematicians, scientists, mainly physicists actually, mathematicians, and also I think there's an economist also. And they met regularly. I think it was a Thursday evening or some day like that, yeah? And met in Vienna and discuss philosophy and philosophical views of science. Yeah? And their narrative is basically based on the idea that science is built on two foundations, namely rationalism and empiricism. Yeah? And empiricism refers to the empirical part of scientific knowledge, yeah? The fact that science is based on empirical data, observations, and so on. And the rational part of science refers basically to logic and mathematics. So scientific knowledge is built on these two foundations. And in a sense, this is an extension of Enlightenment philosophy, especially Kant's epistemology, where Kant also rejected metaphysics and said that true knowledge only has two foundations, which is the rational and the empirical. Other than that, there is no valid source of knowledge, and any claim towards knowing something beyond the rational and the empirical cannot be accepted. So metaphysics for Kant is not possible. It is not possible to have knowledge which goes beyond the boundaries of our five senses and also our rational and logical thought. Yeah. And the logical positivists, they were marked and characterized by their anti-metaphysical stance. Yeah, they rejected metaphysics, just like what Kant said. They said that metaphysics is not possible. Yeah? And they claim that science is only built on empiricism, empirical data, empirical information, and also rational thought. Yeah? And therefore, if you look at science as the supreme model of human knowledge, then anything that wants to claim the status of knowledge has to follow the scientific model. Yeah? And therefore, their concern is to deal with the problem of theoretical entities in science. What is meant by theoretical entities? For example, atoms, protons, and electrons, which are not observable. Yeah, you cannot see an electron, for example, even under a microscope. Yeah, so they are not observable, in other words. Yeah, these theoretical entities, also electromagnetic waves, for example, they are not observable, but they are nevertheless present in science. Yeah, scientists refer to them, yeah, in explaining natural phenomena, physical phenomena, and so on. For example, chemical reactions. They explain in terms of chemical bonding and bonding of atoms and molecules, and exchange of electrons, and so on. But you don't see these electrons moving from one atom to another. Yeah, these are not observable. Yeah? But the scientists postulate those theoretical entities as part of their explanation of natural phenomena, chemical phenomena, and physical phenomena, and so on. So for the positivists, who regarded this as metaphysical also, because they are unobservable, they have to sort this problem out. And their way of dealing with it is to try and explicate scientific theories which involve theoretical entities simply or purely in terms of empirical data and sense experience. So they say that all this talk about, for example, electrons, yeah, moving from a higher energy level to a lower energy level, and thereby radiating energy and electromagnetic waves. This sort of talk is really an indirect way of referring to empirical phenomena. And what is the empirical phenomena? The empirical phenomena is, for example, the light spectrum, which is formed on a photographic plate. So hydrogen has its own characteristic spectrum. Other gases also, oxygen has its own characteristic spectrum, and so on. So the empiricists or logical empiricists would say that this is what is really being referred to. Yeah. So talk of electrons jumping from one energy level to another energy level, and so on. These mainly talk in terms of models or theoretical ideas that do not refer to a separate reality other than the empirical observations, like, for example, the spectrum, light spectrum on a photographic plate. Yeah? So they have what are known as correspondence rules to match the unobservables with the empirical phenomena. So the early logical positivists, they were not scientific realists. In other words, they don't believe that atomic theory, for example, really refer to atoms which really exist. Yeah. For them, everything is just surface phenomena characterized by the empirical data. Yeah. So for them, it's all sense experience. So they're very strong empiricists in a sense. Yeah? Although, of course, they combine the empiricism with a form of rationalism that is based on logic, because they say that concepts are built from sense experience being strung together, statements regarding sense experience being strung together through logical means, yeah, by logical concepts. Yeah. So it's highly empiricist, yeah, in its epistemology. And the point there is that they wanted to reject metaphysics, yeah, because they claim that metaphysical knowledge is not possible, and thereby, if you admit all these theoretical entities, they think that it's bringing metaphysics into science, yeah, and they don't want that. Okay, can we move to the next slide, please? And they also want to create a criteria for meaningful discourse based on the interpretation of the nature of scientific knowledge. Yeah? And so they make a distinction between meaningful and meaningless statements based on the principle of verification. So for the logical positivists, just like the earlier empiricists, like for example, David Hume, they say that there can only be two types of truth or statements which are meaningful, which are analytic statements, which are logical truths, like for example, a logical tautology such as either P or not P, which is a tautology, so this is a logical truth, or statements which are empirically verifiable based on the principle of verification. That means there's a method for empirically verifying whether that statement is true or false by carrying out a set of operations in order to determine whether the statement can be empirically verified. Yeah. So if a statement is not empirically verifiable, that means there is no empirical way of finding out whether that statement is true or not. And if it is not a logical truth or tautology, then it is not a meaningful statement. It is not a meaningful statement. For example, a statement like, God exists outside of space and time. God is transcendent and exists outside of space and time. Yeah? So such a statement cannot be empirically verified, because in order for something to be empirically verified, it has to be in space and time. So how is it possible to empirically verify something which does not exist in space and time? Yeah. So the concept of God is considered as empirically not verifiable, and it's not a logical truth. Therefore, they would reject a statement like God exists or God created the world. Yeah? It's considered as a meaningless statement because of the criteria of what a meaningful statement and what a meaningful discourse is. Yeah? So by such a criteria, they manage to exclude certain fields of knowledge like metaphysics, theology, literature as having cognitive content. Instead, these forms of knowledge are consigned to the realm of emotions, ethical preference, or imagination. And if you remember the talk about the separation of facts and values, this idea comes from the logical positivism. They wanted a separation of facts and values in social science, for example. So you can see the two main ideas of the logical positivists, that is their rejection of metaphysics in science and also metaphysics as a whole, and their attempt to reconstruct scientific theories without reference to theoretical entities which they consider as metaphysical, and explicate theories simply in terms of sense experience or empirical data through some sort of logical reconstruction, for example, the Ramsey sentence and so on. And their anti-metaphysical stance, and also their criteria for meaningful discourse. So you can see how these two strategies, these two ways of characterizing knowledge puts science as being epistemologically privileged and reject other forms of knowledge as being genuine knowledge. Yeah. And it puts science as being epistemologically privileged based on a certain interpretation of science. For example, science as being something which is not metaphysical. Its concepts can be explained purely in terms of sense experience. And that the criteria for meaningful discourse is satisfied by science and not by other forms of knowledge. So all these are philosophical legitimations of science, yeah, and ways of making science to be epistemologically privileged over all other forms of knowledge, in the sense that, it satisfies criteria like meaningful statements or meaningful discourse, based on the idea of meaningfulness being based on only those statements which are empirically verifiable or that they're logical truths. Yeah? And the early Wittgenstein subscribed to such a viewpoint, the viewpoint articulated by the logical positivists, for example. And Wittgenstein was also in Vienna. Yeah? He, if I'm not mistaken, he joined some of the sessions, if I'm not mistaken. Also subscribed to such a viewpoint in his earlier book known as the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. He has two major works. One is the Tractatus, in short form it's referred to as the Tractatus. And that is a reflection of his earlier philosophical beliefs, yeah, which are basically positivistic. But later on in the Philosophical Investigations, yeah, the second work, he rejected the notion of truth as being determined by logical and empirical means only, and moved on and adopted the idea or the theory of language games, yeah, where there is no single standard of meaning, but that meaning of a word or statement depends on the context in which it is uttered. So the scientific criteria of meaningfulness is not the only criteria that can be formulated and adopted or extended to other fields of knowledge. So a word might not be meaningful according to science, but it could be considered as meaningful in a different context. Yeah, for example, the word dragon. The word dragon might be seen scientifically meaningless because it is not empirically verifiable. You don't find paleontological evidence of the existence of dragons, but you do find paleontological evidence for the existence of dinosaurs. So the word or the concept dinosaur is meaningful in that sense. It is empirically verifiable. There is empirical data to support the claim that dinosaurs had existed before. But as far as dragons are concerned, there is no such empirical verification. So from a scientific point of view, a word or concept like dragon has no meaning. But according to Wittgenstein's theory of language games, where different games have different rules, yeah, he borrowed this analogy from games. Yeah? Like a game of rugby is different from a game of soccer, and they have different rules. So if you want to play rugby, you have to follow the rules of rugby, and you want to play soccer, you have to follow the rules of soccer. You cannot, in soccer, take the ball with your hand and then run away to the goalpost. Yeah? So similarly, in the case of language, this is philosophy of language. In the case of language, the word dragon might not have meaning in a scientific context, in physics or biology, or the life sciences in general. It might not have a meaning, yeah, because it's not empirically verifiable. But if you use the phrase dragon dance, yeah, to describe an event during Chinese New Year where dragon dance is performed, then it becomes a meaningful concept. And also, the word dragon itself, as it is used in Chinese cultural beliefs, becomes acceptable because it is part of that culture and part of their cultural beliefs. And the word is connected, meaningfully connected to some other forms of belief, some other beliefs within the Chinese culture, for example. Yeah. So, and people can communicate by referring to these words. So it acquires a meaning within that cultural context. Yeah. So there is no single criteria of determining whether a word or sentence is meaningful or not. So that in this case, even the word God becomes meaningful according to Wittgenstein's theory of games, because the way it is used in religion, it refers to something which is different from any known existing thing. So therefore, it cannot be subjected to empirical and rational criteria, because the idea of God as found in religion postulates something totally different. Yeah. And people can communicate with each other using that concept, and it's meaningful to them. So why should science determine what is counted as meaningful or not? Why should we follow science? Yeah? On what basis can science claim to be the final judge of meaning of words in different contexts? Yeah? So later on, Wittgenstein pointed this out. Yeah? Okay, and then we move on to Karl Popper. Yeah, and contrary to the earlier logical positivists who justified scientific knowledge on the basis of empirical verification or confirmation of a scientific theory using inductive logic, Popper rejected the approach and instead adopted the concept of falsification to distinguish between science and pseudoscience. So, well, let me see if I've put somewhere here. Let me explain this a bit more, because it's too brief and too cryptic, what I mean by this. Yeah. Okay, although I think it's in the next slide, but never mind, I will explain it here. You see,
Prof, please unmute, Prof. It's by mistake. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. Okay. Sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the logical positivists said that scientific theories are accepted because they have been verified based on empirical data or confirmed by the empirical data to be true. Yeah. So the concept of verification or confirmation of a theory based on the empirical evidence is a standard view, and it's a view which has been articulated by the logical empiricists also. Yeah. And I suppose for all intents and purposes, this idea seems to be commonsensical, yeah, and therefore acceptable. Yeah? Although, of course, not all commonsensical ideas are acceptable from philosophical point of view, but never mind. What I mean to say here is that it sounds quite reasonable to say that you accept a scientific theory because there is evidence to support that theory or to prove that it is true, that the evidence, empirical evidence, shows that the theory is true. So science, the scientific methodology is an attempt to prove the truth of theories. Yeah. So that was the standard view, and that was the view associated with the logical positivists. Yeah? But Popper rejected this view and introduced instead the concept of falsification. Yeah, which initially looks counterintuitive. Yeah, because for Popper, it's the opposite. He said that that a theory can only be considered to be scientific if it is capable of being proven false, not of being proven true. Yeah. So that is the very opposite of what the logical positivists were saying. Who said that in order for us to accept a theory, it has to be proven true. And of course, it's not ultimate truth, because you cannot say for sure, 100% sure, that the theory is true, because the evidence is based on a limited set of data, and that you make a sort of an inductive inference from the limited set of data and generalize it to a conclusion. So you cannot have certainty in that sense. When you use inductive inference, you cannot have certainty. Yeah. So for the logical positivists or logical empiricists, they say that you can only confirm a theory, meaning to say that you can say that it is true with a high probability, for example. Yeah? Based on the evidence, you can say the theory is true with a high probability. But the idea there is to show the truth of the theory. Yeah? But for Popper, it's the opposite. If a theory is a scientific theory, then instead of saying that the theory is true based on the empirical evidence, what you have to do is to show whether that theory can be proven false. Yeah, and this is his famous concept of falsification. That scientific theory is a theory which can or should in principle be proven false, be capable of being proven false. Yeah. Otherwise, it is not a scientific theory. Yeah. Why does Popper come with this supposedly weird kind of idea of acceptance of a theory based on the idea of falsification rather than confirming it to be true? Yeah. Now the reason Popper gave is this. Because during that time, yeah, I think it was the first half of the 20th century, there were various theories that claim scientific status. And Popper had in mind one field of knowledge in particular, which is psychiatry or psychoanalysis. Yeah. Of course, famous psychoanalysts like Sigmund Freud and so on, they were from Vienna also. Yeah. Wittgenstein also was from Vienna. So Freud claimed that psychiatry is, or psychoanalysis is scientific because it is based on the scientific method of induction. That is, according to Freud, he had amassed lots of empirical data which act as empirical evidence for his psychological theories and concepts. Yeah. And also in astrology, they collect a lot of data, astronomical data, in order to come up with their astrological concepts or ideas. Yeah? And also in the field of social science, Marxist theory of society called scientific socialism and dialectical materialism also claimed to have scientific status because, according to Marx, for example, the historical evidence points in its favor. Yeah. So because of this, because of what Popper calls pseudosciences claiming scientific status on the basis of confirmation or verification based on empirical data, Popper says that some other criteria should be formulated in order to prevent these so-called sciences, which are for Popper really pseudosciences, to prevent them from being accepted as genuine science. Yeah. So that's the motivation behind Popper's concept of falsification, actually. It is to weed out to exclude this kind of theories from claiming scientific status. Yeah? Because according to Popper, like for example, Marx's theory of society, dialectical materialism, so scientific socialism, so on and so on, which says that, history is a history of class struggle, and ultimately there will be a classless society. His prophecy of prediction, based on his interpretation of history. Yeah. Now, according to Popper, such beliefs are not scientific because they cannot be proven false. Any evidence that might indicate the falsity of the theory is somehow rather explained away. It means there's always some ad hoc explanation to show why that is not a counter evidence. Yeah. So in other words, the theory is always protected from being falsified, from being proven false. And also psychoanalysis, according to Popper, they could not set down, or they did not set down certain conditions which would show that the theory is false. All they're interested in is to show that the theory is true. So there is no way the theory can be falsified. And for Popper, this is similar to dogmatic beliefs in theology or whatever, where once you have accepted a theory or a belief, come what may, you will defend it against criticisms. Yeah. So for Popper, the true mark of science is falsification, because in field of science, mature science like physics, for example, when you carry out an experimental test, the results can go either way. It can either show that the theory is false, or that the results can support or confirm the theory. Yeah. So, in other words, the theory is capable of being proven false. The results can falsify the theory. So, physical theories or theories in physics are scientific because of that. Because experimental evidence can go either way, and that it can also show that the theory is false. Yeah? So for Popper, science is different from dogma, for example. It is different from theology, or it's different from pseudoscience like psychoanalysis or social scientific theories like Marxist social theory that wants to be accepted on the basis of its scientific status. These cannot pass the test of falsification, according to Popper. And therefore, there is reason for rejecting them as scientific knowledge. Yeah. So Popper wants to privilege science, but at the same time, he saw the dangers of those fields which are not really scientific wanting to be accepted because of its methodology, which is purported to be a scientific form of methodology. Yeah. So Popper saw that the positivist criteria of theory acceptance would not exclude this sort of pseudosciences from being accepted as science. Yeah. And so he came up with this new concept of falsification. But as far as I can see, although Popper tried to distinguish himself or differentiate himself from the logical positivists and claim that his philosophy is different from theirs, I believe, on the contrary, that it is basically a family quarrel, the way I put it. Yeah, whether to privilege inductive logic or whether to privilege deductive logic. Yeah, but the idea here is the same, or the aim is the same, which is to privilege scientific knowledge, to say that science is the ideal form of human knowledge, and that no other forms of human knowledge fulfill the conditions for genuine knowledge which science does. Yeah. So the difference is mainly in the way they did it, their method of approach. Yeah? But as far as the aim is concerned, in trying to convince modern society, modern culture, that of all the belief systems that exist, it is the scientific belief system that is most reliable and philosophically justified. Yeah, and is the justification that forms the legitimating basis of science. That is the attempt towards the legitimation of science. Okay, can we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, now apart from trying to overcome the weaknesses of the logical positivists in the legitimation of science, because you see here, the way I look at it is, Popper was aware of the narrative of legitimation that the logical positivists were trying to present and trying to ground science on a philosophical basis. Yeah, he was aware, but he saw the weaknesses in the narrative provided by logical positivists. Yeah, weaknesses that exist so much so that true science might not be legitimized according to the philosophy of the logical positivists. So that was his worry, that science might not be properly legitimized in modern society, in modern culture, if you go by the standards of logical positivism. So it's not that he was against logical positivism in its attempt to legitimize science, but he was more concerned with the weaknesses that are present in logical positivism that might not enable it to do the job of legitimizing science. So that's why he came in and came up with his new philosophy. And this attempt at legitimizing science can also be seen in another strand of Popper's thought and another line of thought which he developed. And this is his idea of theory change in science. Theory change in science. Yeah? And I think he was also particularly aware of the dynamic nature of scientific knowledge. If you look at, for example, not only philosophy, but the history of science, you will find that scientific theories do not remain the same over time, that scientific theories do change, yeah, historically. So for example, you have a change from Newton's theory in physics to Einstein's theory. And in addition, you have quantum theory and so on. So the fact that scientific theories do change could present problems in the philosophical justification of science or the philosophical image of science. Yeah. How could that be? Well, the fact that theories change might be taken as an indication of a lack of certainty in scientific knowledge. Yeah, that what is true today might not be true tomorrow, basically. Yeah. So critics of science, and including those who want to privilege religion over science, would say that, look, how can you believe in science when it is quite possible that tomorrow those theories might change? So what you believe to be true today might not be true tomorrow. Yeah. So if you believe in Newton's theory before, and then you live long enough to get into the 20th century with Einstein's theories and so on, then you will discard those earlier Newtonian beliefs and adopt Einstein's physics. Yeah. So the fact that theories change in science, theories change in science, could be taken as an indication that science does not give us absolute truth. Because as I've said earlier, what is true today might not be true tomorrow. Yeah. So change can be a problem in the philosophical legitimation of science and in presenting a positive image of science. Yeah. So what did Popper do in order to overcome this? Well, he has a new and a different legitimizing strategy, which is not present in the logical positivists, because the logical positivists, they look at science in static terms, in terms of a finished product, and then just study the logical structure of the stories of scientific theories. Yeah? So the dynamics of science, the dynamical change of science is not properly addressed in logical positivism. But Popper was aware that here is again another weakness that needs to be addressed. That is the problem of change in science. Yeah? So Popper turned the tables by saying that scientific change is something which is good for science. It presents a good image for science instead of the opposite. How is that so? Well, according to Popper, it shows that science is rational. It shows the rationality of science. The rationality of science can be seen when a new theory, which is better than the old theory, is accepted on the basis of some rational criteria. Like, for example, the new theory is better supported by the evidence, by the empirical evidence. The new theory is more logically coherent compared to the old theory. Some sort of criteria like that, yeah, which shows the rationality of science and of scientists in choosing the old theory, the new theory over the old theory. Yeah. So the rationality resides in the theory itself because of the characteristics that it possesses, and also in the scientists who make a rational decision in changing from the old theory to the new theory. So change indicates rationality of science, which is positive for science. And another point which Popper mentioned and pushed for in his legitimation strategy is to say that when theories change in science, they are really progressing towards the truth. So scientific change implies progression towards the truth. So again, another positive thing for science. Yeah. Instead of saying that this indicates lack of certainty and so on, he looks at it in a positive manner. He says that this shows that science is bringing us closer and closer to the truth. Yeah. So change is really change towards the better and towards the truth. Yeah. So in that sense, Popper has turned the tables around, yeah, and said and make change as something positive for science. Yeah. However, his theory of progress towards the truth, science has been progressing to the truth, is based on his logical theory of verisimilitude. It's a very technical theory based on mathematical logic, yeah, to show that theories, when they change, they decrease in falsity content and increase in truth content, but they all have falsity content. So technically, when theory has falsity content, it is considered as a false theory. Yeah? But according to Popper, false theories can be rank ordered, meaning to say that you can say one false theory is better than another false theory because the falsity content of the better theory is less than the falsity content of the theory which is superseded. Yeah, but the logician David Miller pointed out in his critique of Popper's theory of verisimilitude that you cannot rank order false theories. As long as they consider as false, that means there's falsity content, it's not possible to say that A is better than B is better than C in terms of verisimilitude. So there's a breakdown in Popper's justification for scientific progression towards the truth. Yeah, and that presented a real problem in Popper's philosophical legitimation of science as progressive. Yeah? Okay, can we move on? Okay, and then here is another grand narrative for the legitimation of science seen as a whole. But here, it's not really legitimation in the form that we saw earlier amongst the logical positivists and also in Karl Popper. It's a way of providing a sort of a holistic or globalist philosophical picture of science. But the philosophical picture which emerged is quite contrary to the ones which have been articulated earlier by the logical positivists and by Karl Popper. So it's not legitimation per se, but it's an attempt at trying to locate science within the broader context of human knowledge and culture and so on. So it's comparable in that sense. And his ideas are articulated in his famous book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Yeah, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. And although Thomas Kuhn was a historian of science, that book made him popular with the philosophers of science, yeah, who saw that as a work in philosophy of science also, but a philosophy of science in a new kind, a new way of doing philosophy of science, because it brought history into the picture. Yeah, and Kuhn came up with his model of scientific knowledge based on his historical analysis of science. Yeah, and in so doing, Kuhn criticized the earlier approaches to the philosophy of science, where, according to him, the earlier philosophical accounts of science were sort of idealized accounts, idealized accounts of science that cannot be supported by the historical facts, by the historical evidence. Yeah. For Kuhn, if you look at history, that is not a true description of science. You're not really talking about science. You're talking about something else. You're talking about some imaginary, fictional, not the reality of science. The reality of science, according to Kuhn, is different as shown by history. So ultimately, you can only judge whether a philosophical concept about science is acceptable or not based on whether it squares with the historical evidence, whether the historical evidence supports such a philosophical view of science. So this is Kuhn's new criteria in trying to assess the acceptability or validity of a certain philosophical viewpoint on science. Yeah. A simple example would be this, the idea of falsification. According to Kuhn, it is rarely the case that a scientific theory becomes rejected just because there is experimental evidence against it. Yeah. Kuhn does not deny that there are experimental evidence against a particular theory, for example. But he said that unlike what Popper said, it did not lead to its immediate falsification. What happens is that these counter evidence are taken in as anomalies. That means they did not fit into the theory. They did not fit into the existing theory or paradigm. Yeah. And only after there's an accumulation of such anomalies does the theory gets shaken and ultimately replaced by another theory. But it's not immediate. It's not like what Popper said, that if evidence, well, he has this logic called modus tollens. Yeah? T implies E, Experimental evidence says not E, therefore not T. As easy as that in terms of deductive logic. But according to Kuhn, historically, that's not what happens. So history is not simply an instantiation of deductive logic. Yeah? History shows the facts that happen in the development of science. And so for Kuhn, if you look at science from a historical angle, you will find that the image of science as being rational, objective, and progressing towards the truth cannot be sustained. Yeah, cannot be sustained. And also the idea of incommensurability of theories, that is, you cannot really compare two theories because you're comparing apples with oranges, according to Kuhn. Yeah, because according to Kuhn, for example, the concepts are different. There's a semantic difference. In other words, for example, the concept of mass, the concept of energy, they are different in Newton's theory and Einstein's theory. In Newton's theory, mass is a constant and it cannot change its value. Whereas in Einstein, the value of the mass is not necessarily constant depending on its velocity, and that mass can also be converted into energy. Whereas in Newton, matter can neither be created nor destroyed. Yeah. So in what sense can you say that you are comparing two theories when they are using concepts in different ways to mean different things? Yeah. So all these things pose challenge to the standard view of science as being objective, rational, progressive, and so on. Yeah. And Kuhn's controversial work created a debate. Yeah, and there was actually a debate which took place in London, in Bedford College, yeah, between the followers of Kuhn and Popper, and eventually published as a book by Lakatos, Criticism and the Growth of Knowledge. Yeah. So these are attempts at giving the big picture of science in philosophical terms. And we saw here what happened was, initially it was the legitimation attempt of the modernist philosophers that tried to present what I would call the standard status quo view of science as being objective, rational, progressive, and so on, progressing to the truth. And this view was later challenged by Kuhn, undermined to some extent, and later by Feyerabend, who also extended Kuhn's ideas. And then later on, can we move on to the next slide? And then we find other groups coming in, the social constructivists, who also denied the claim that science is rational, objective, and a pure reflection of the objective state of the natural world and so on. So this idea that social interests and social influences penetrate into the construction of scientific knowledge, this is the idea of the social constructivists. Again, aiming at a critique or criticism of the idea that science is purely objective knowledge about the natural world and so on. So here you can see that the discourse in philosophy of science have moved, yeah, from the earlier attempts at legitimation of science and privileging of science to its opposite position, to the contrary view that science is not necessarily rational, objective, and so on, based on equally scholarly studies, yeah, but disputed by some scholars who want to retain the old image of science. Yeah. So this is basically the situation that exists in contemporary Western philosophy of science now, yeah? And it's referred to by the phrase "the science wars." The science wars. That means there is a war or contestation in the construction of the image of science. You see, all these attempts, they are really attempts at constructing a particular image of science. Because science is science. Yeah? What is different is the image of science that we construct philosophically. Yeah? And what it shows is this wider struggle in Western thought itself between what is known as modernist philosophies and postmodernist philosophies. The earlier modernist picture of the world, of knowledge and so on, is based on the sort of the old school idea of, science as being rational, objective, progressive, and so on. But the newer post-positivist and postmodernist attempts at depicting science portray it as something which is not so rational, which is not so objective, and does not converge towards the truth. It's not a progressive convergence towards the truth. So I think I only have time to explain these concepts so far, but I hope I have communicated to you the sense that in the Western academia at the moment, at present, there is this contestation between these two streams or schools of thought. One which is pro-science basically, and one which is anti-science, that is trying to sort of claim for itself what the image of science really is. Yeah? And I don't have time to connect this with the Islamic view of science and Islamic critiques of science, which to me share some similarities with the post-positivist and post-modernist critiques of science, although they are based on different epistemological foundations. Yeah? So I have to end here because of the time limit. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Prof. We'll continue next week. We have Islamic philosophy of science. We have this comparing post-positivists and postmodernists. And we have Andrew Gilbert. I think Prof spent a lot on this Andrew Gilbert also next time. And then Gellner, inshallah.
Yeah, so, it gets heavier.
Inshallah. So we open to question. Okay, we have one from Brother Nuruddin. Prof, can you read from the chat?
Yes,
okay, because it will save time if you can read it, right? Yeah. Go ahead, Prof.
Okay. Now, explain the difference between the earlier and the later Wittgenstein. Yeah? So, the earlier Wittgenstein's, his philosophy of science is basically positivistic. In other words, quite similar to the views of the logical positivists. Yeah, I mean, like standards of meaningful discourse. What is a meaningful statement, and so on, and what is a meaningless statement, and so on. They are all based on the scientific view of things. Yeah, so language has to be referred to in order to determine whether it is cognitively meaningful. One has to refer to the nature of scientific knowledge. Yeah, which is in which the sentence or the statement is meaningful if it is either analytic or synthetic, which is either logical or empirical. So that the meaning of a word is determined by such criteria, yeah, or rather the meaning, the fact as to whether the word has meaning or not, cognitive meaning or not, has to be based on such criteria, which is really derived from scientific knowledge. Yeah, so that's the earlier Wittgenstein. He shared those beliefs with the logical positivists. That, for example, a statement that the cat is on the mat, yeah, is acceptable because you can empirically verify whether there's an actual cat there and whether it's sitting on the mat. Yeah, the famous philosophy example: a cat is sitting on the mat. Yeah? But a statement like, for example, dragons used to roam the earth 5,000 years ago or something. That sort of statement cannot be empirically verified, and therefore you cannot accept the word dragon as being meaningful, and the statement which has the word dragon in it is therefore also meaningless. Yeah. But the later Wittgenstein changed his view and said that, well, meaning depends on context. Yeah, so much so that even if a word is meaningless in the scientific context, it could be meaningful in a non-scientific context. Yeah,
True.
and he makes the analogy with games. That's why this idea is known as language games. He made the comparison with games. He said that if you look at different games, they have different rules. Yeah, and in order to play a game, you have to follow the rules allowed in that game. Yeah. So, for example, if you compare rugby with soccer, yeah, they have different rules, and you cannot play rugby by the rules of soccer and vice versa, and you cannot play soccer by the rules of rugby. Yeah, you cannot, for example, uh, in soccer, take the ball by the hand and then run towards the goalpost. Yeah, which is allowed in rugby perhaps, but not in soccer. Yeah. So making that analogy and comparing it with the situation in epistemology, Wittgenstein argued that similarly, when we use language differently in different contexts. Yeah, and they acquire meaning in different contexts. Yeah, so that if the word cannot be scientifically verified, yeah, but people in that community are able to communicate with each other by using that word. Yeah, it's a tool of communication. Then it's acceptable because that's the rule of the game in that culture or society. Yeah. So there isn't only one universal way of determining meaning, which applies to all contexts according to Wittgenstein. So that's the difference between the earlier and the later. Yeah? The later is more liberal. The earlier is very sort of narrow. I like to add to that. My lecturer last time make this joke, which I think illustrates the point. I said that there is this American professor. He's now dead, and he's a positivist. And when he went to Britain, he saw the sign, zebra crossing. And he said, I don't see any zebras crossing here. So you see, so he took it literally, zebra crossing, but what that word means is something else. Yeah? But people living in that area know what zebra crossing is, so they don't have problems with the word. Okay.
Okay, there's a second and a third one, bro. in the chat box.
Chat. I cannot see it here.
Oh, you can see it. The second question and the third question. We'll continue later. Up to you.
Okay.
Okay.
Let me see if I can click here. I click the chat, but
it doesn't come out.
It doesn't appear.
Oh, okay. But you can read it earlier.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Number 2, please explain whether the difference of similarity between logical positivism and hypnosis. I believe that total entities also exist out there objectively. Okay, this one I'm not really sure because I don't know what Ibn Sina says about theoretical entities, what he means by theoretical entities. If you can give examples, then it might be clearer. But in the context I use it, theoretical entities refer to, for example, abstract concepts in science like protons, electrons, atoms, and so on. But obviously, those do not exist during his time, Ibn Sina's time. So I don't know what is meant by theoretical entities there. Okay. Okay. Number 3. Please explain why Popper seems to be inclined negatively towards theories in social sciences which he thinks cannot be falsified, such as Marxism and Freudianism, Freudian psychology, while Einstein's relativity is an example of theory that can be falsified. Furthermore, did he consider physics to be Darwin's science because he had previously stated that Darwin's theory could not be falsified? Okay. Now, why is he against Marxism and Freudianism? Okay. Now, okay, here, maybe you can sort of cast suspicions on Popper on this score, because Popper confessed that he's anti-Marxist. Yeah, he's against Marxism. Yeah, because of his liberal philosophy. Yeah, liberal social philosophy. So he's against Marxism. But I think if that is his purpose, then he would have criticized Marxism on his own terms. Yeah? But here, I think why he stepped in is because Marx claimed that his theory is scientific. His theory about social development, for example, that society is a history of class struggle, and everything can be explained in terms of class struggle. And there is no way of refuting this theory. Yeah. Whereas we can clearly see, for example, like the Crusades, for example, is a ideological battle between people of different religions. The Crusades, Muslims and Christians. So how can you say that it is a class struggle? But according to Popper, advocates of Marxist theory will always find ways and means of trying to answer those kinds of objections. So because of that, because it can only be defended and accepted as true, so there is no way of showing that the theory is false. And therefore, according to Popper, this is not scientific, because science is not like that. In science, you don't go out of your way to defend and protect a theory if the evidence is against it. Yeah. So it's quite a sort of neutral methodology to me. Yeah. And so I think I would accept Popper's argument on that point, yeah, about social science and the criteria of science and social science. Yeah? Okay. Yes, I think he would consider physics to be the most advanced, most mature science. And about Darwin's theory could not be falsified. That one I'm not very sure, yeah, exactly what is said. So I wouldn't go into that. Yeah.
Okay. The last one, Prof.
The last one.
Some example of theory change of science in daily life. Yeah.
Well, theory change does not occur in daily life. I say, it's not that every day that theories change. You know, it takes a long time for theories to change. An example which I gave was the change from Newton's theory in physics to Einstein's theory. Yeah, that it is an example of a theory change. Or in some other field, maybe, yeah, in astronomy, for example, the change from geocentric theory by Ptolemy to a heliocentric theory by Copernicus. Yeah, so that's another of a big change in theory. Previously, people accept that the Earth is the center of the world, and they changed to Copernicus's theory. We now regard the sun as being the center of the solar system. Yeah, so those are examples of theory change in science. Yeah.
Okay, Prof. Thank you. Thank you so much. Final word for tonight, Prof. After a long discussion, maybe in 1-2 minutes.
Yes. Well, I think that one has to understand the discourse that is going on in Western academia, in Western philosophy of science especially, in order to understand some of the issues that are currently being debated the world over amongst academics about what modernity consists in, what is involved in modernity, and what is the epistemological basis of modernity. Because if you want to talk about, for example, Islam and its relation to the modern world, then the epistemological basis must be understood. And by understanding the Western discourse, we can then present our own Islamic perspective within that framework. Yeah? And therefore be able to engage constructively, intellectually, with current debates on modernity and beliefs. Yeah?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. See you next week, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Okay. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala.
Waalaikumsalam.